The original World Trade Center was a large complex of 7 buildings in Lower Manhattan, New York City, United States. It featured landmark Twin Towers, which opened on April 4, 1973, and were destroyed in the September 11, 2001 attacks, with 7 World Trade Center collapsing later that day due to the damage it suffered when the Twin Towers collapsed that morning. The other buildings in the complex were severely damaged by the collapse of the Twin Towers, and their ruins were eventually demolished. At the time of their completion, the Twin Towers, the original One World Trade Center, at 1,368 feet, and Two World Trade Center, at 1,362 feet, were the tallest buildings in the world. The other buildings in the complex included the Marriott World Trade Center, 4 WTC, 5 WTC, 6 WTC, and 7 WTC. All these buildings were built between 1975 and 1985, with a construction cost of $400 million. The complex was located in New York City's financial district and contained 13,400,000 square feet of office space. The World Trade Center experienced a fire on February 13, 1975, a bombing on February 26, 1993, and a robbery on January 14, 1998. In 1998, the Port Authority decided to privatize the World Trade Center, leasing the buildings to a private company to manage, and awarded the lease to Silverstein Properties in July 2001. On the morning of September 11, 2001, Al-Qaeda-affiliated hijackers flew 2 Boeing 767 jets into the complex, beginning with the North Tower at 8:46 a.m., then the South Tower at 9:03 a.m., in a coordinated act of terrorism. After burning for 56 minutes, the South Tower collapsed at 9:59 a.m. At 10:28 a.m., the North Tower collapsed. The attacks on the World Trade Center killed 2,763 people. Falling debris from the towers, combined with fires that the debris initiated in several surrounding buildings, led to the partial or complete collapse of all the other buildings in the complex and caused catastrophic damage to 10 other large structures in the surrounding area, including the World Financial Center and Deutsche Bank building. 3 buildings in the World Trade Center complex collapsed due to fire-induced structural failure, and when the North Tower collapsed, debris fell on the nearby 7 WTC, damaging it and starting fires so that it eventually collapsed. The process of cleaning up and recovery at the World Trade Center site took 8 months. The World Trade Center complex was rebuilt over a span of more than a decade. The site is being rebuilt with 6 new skyscrapers, while a memorial to those killed in the attacks and a new rapid transit hub have both opened. One World Trade Center, the tallest building in the United States, is the lead building for the new complex, reaching more than 100 stories upon its completion in November 2014. Before the World Trade Center, the western portion of the World Trade Center site was originally under the Hudson River, with the shoreline in the vicinity of Greenwich Street. It was on this shoreline, close to the intersection of Greenwich and the former Day Street, that Dutch explorer Adrian Block's ship, the Tiger, burned to the waterline in November 1613, stranding Block and his crew and forcing them to overwinter on the island. They built the first European settlement in Manhattan. The remains of the ship were buried under landfill when the shoreline was extended starting in 1797, and were discovered during excavation work in 1916. The remains of a second ship from the 18th century were discovered in 2010 during excavation work at the site. The ship, believed to be a Hudson River sloop, was found just south of where the Twin Towers used to stand, about 20 feet below the surface. Later, the area became Radio Row. New York City's Radio Row, which existed from 1921 to 1966, was a warehouse district on the Lower West Side in the financial district. Harry Schneck opened City Radio on Cortlandt Street in 1921, and eventually the area held several blocks of electronics stores, with Cortlandt Street as its central axis. The used radios wore surplus electronics, junk, and parts often piled so high they would spill out onto the street, attracting collectors and scroungers. According to a business writer, it also was the origin of the electronic component distribution business. The idea of establishing a World Trade Center in New York City was first proposed in 1943. The New York State Legislature passed a bill authorizing New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey to begin developing plans for the project, but the plans were put on hold in 1949. During the late 1940s and 1950s, economic growth in New York City was concentrated in Midtown Manhattan. To help stimulate urban renewal in Lower Manhattan, David Rockefeller suggested that the Port Authority build a World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan. Plans for the use of eminent domain to remove the shops in Radio Row bounded by Vesey, Church, Liberty, and West Streets began in 1961 when the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey was deciding to build the world's first World Trade Center. They had two choices: the east side of Lower Manhattan, near the South Street Seaport, and the west side, near the H&M Station, Hudson Terminal. Initial plans, made public in 1961, identified a site along the East River for the World Trade Center. As a bi-state agency, the Port Authority required approval for new projects from the governors of both New York and New Jersey. New Jersey Governor Robert B. Menner objected to New York getting a $335 million project. Toward the end of 1961, negotiations with outgoing New Jersey Governor Menner reached a stalemate. At the time, ridership on New Jersey's Hudson and Manhattan Railroad had declined substantially from a high of 113 million riders in 1927 to 26 million in 1958. After new automobile tunnels and bridges had opened across the Hudson River. In a December 1961 meeting between Port Authority Director Austin J. Tobin and newly elected New Jersey Governor Richard J. Hughes, the Port Authority offered to take over the Hudson and Manhattan Railroad to have it become the Port Authority Trans-Hudson. The Port Authority also decided to move the World Trade Center project to the Hudson Terminal building site on the west side of Lower Manhattan, a more convenient location for New Jersey commuters arriving via PATH. With the new location and Port Authority acquisition of the H&M Railroad, New Jersey agreed to support the World Trade Center project. In compensation for Radio Row business owners' displacement, the PANYNJ gave each business $3,000 each, without regard to how long the business had been there or how prosperous the business was. After the area had been purchased for the World Trade Center in March 1964, Radio Row was demolished starting in March 1965. It was completely demolished by 1966. Approval was also needed from New York City Mayor John Lindsay and the New York City Council. Disagreements with the city centered on tax issues. On August 3, 1966, an agreement was reached that the Port Authority would make annual payments to the city in lieu of taxes for the portion of the World Trade Center leased to private tenants. In subsequent years, the payments would rise as the real estate tax rate increased. Design and construction. Design. On September 20, 1962, the Port Authority announced the selection of Minoru Yamasaki as lead architect and Emery Roth & Sons as associate architects. Yamasaki devised the plan to incorporate twin towers. Yamasaki's original plan called for the towers to be 80 stories tall, but to meet the Port Authority's requirement for 10 million square feet of office space, the buildings would each have to be 110 stories tall. Yamasaki's design for the World Trade Center, unveiled to the public on January 18, 1964, called for a square plan approximately 208 feet in dimension on each side. The buildings were designed with narrow office windows 18 inches wide, which reflected Yamasaki's fear of heights as well as his desire to make building occupants feel secure. Yamasaki's design included building facades sheathed in aluminum alloy. The World Trade Center was one of the most striking American implementations of the architectural ethic of Le Corbusier, and it was the seminal expression of Yamasaki's Gothic modernist tendencies. A major limiting factor in building height is the issue of elevators. The taller the building, the more elevators are needed to service the building, requiring more space-consuming elevator banks. Yamasaki and the engineers decided to use a new system with 2 sky lobbies, floors where people could switch from a large-capacity express elevator to a local elevator that goes to each floor in a section. This system, inspired by the local express train operation that the New York City subway system used, allowed the design to stack local elevators within the same elevator shaft. Located on the 44th and 78th floors of each tower, the sky lobbies enabled the elevators to be used efficiently, increasing the amount of usable space on each floor from 62 to 75% by reducing the number of elevator shafts. Altogether, the World Trade Center had 95 express and local elevators. The structural engineering firm Worthington, Skilling, Hell & Jackson worked to implement Yamasaki's design, developing the tube frame structural system used in the Twin Towers. The Port Authority's engineering department served as foundation engineers, Joseph R. Loring and Associates as electrical engineers, and Yaros, Baum and Bollis as mechanical engineers. Tishman Realty and Construction Company was the general contractor on the World Trade Center project. Guy F. Tozzoli, director of the World Trade Department at the Port Authority, and Rhino M. Monti, the Port Authority's chief engineer, oversaw the project. As an interstate agency, the Port Authority was not subject to local laws and regulations of the City of New York, including building codes. Nonetheless, the structural engineers of the World Trade Center ended up following draft versions of the new 1968 building codes. The tube frame design, earlier introduced by Fazlur Khan, was a new approach that allowed more open floor plans than the traditional design that distributed columns throughout the interior to support building loads. The World Trade Center towers used high-strength, load-bearing perimeter steel columns called vierendeel trusses that were spaced closely together to form a strong, rigid wall structure, supporting virtually all lateral loads such as wind loads, and sharing the gravity load with the core columns. The perimeter structure, containing 59 columns per side, was constructed with extensive use of prefabricated modular pieces, each consisting of 3 columns, 3 stories tall, connected by spandrel plates. The spandrel plates were welded to the columns to create the modular pieces off-site at the fabrication shop. Adjacent modules were bolted together with the splices occurring at mid-span of the columns and spandrels. The joints between modules were staggered vertically, so that the column splices between adjacent modules were not at the same floor. The core of the towers housed the elevator and utility shafts, restrooms, 3 stairwells, and other support spaces. The core of each tower was a rectangular area 87 by 135 feet and contained 47 steel columns running from the bedrock to the top of the tower. The large, column-free space between the perimeter and core was bridged by prefabricated floor trusses. The floors supported their own weight as well as live loads, providing lateral stability to the exterior walls and distributing wind loads among the exterior walls. The floors consisted of 4 inches thick lightweight concrete slabs laid on a fluted steel deck. A grid of lightweight bridging trusses and main trusses supported the floors. The trusses connected to the perimeter at alternate columns and were on 6-foot 8-inch centers. The top chords of the trusses were bolted to seats welded to the spandrels on the exterior side and a channel welded to the core columns on the interior side. The floors were connected to the perimeter spandrel plates with viscoelastic dampers that helped reduce the amount of sway felt by building occupants. Hat trusses located from the 107th floor to the top of the buildings were designed to support a tall communication antenna on top of each building. Only one WTC actually had an antenna fitted. It was added in 1978. The truss system consisted of 6 trusses along the long axis of the core and 4 along the short axis. This truss system allowed some load redistribution between the perimeter and core columns and supported the transmission tower. The tube frame design, using steel core and perimeter columns protected with sprayed-on fire-resistant material, created a relatively lightweight structure that would sway more in response to the wind compared to traditional structures, such as the Empire State Building, that have thick, heavy masonry for fireproofing of steel structural elements. During the design process, wind tunnel tests were done to establish design wind pressures that the World Trade Center towers could be subjected to and structural response to those forces. Experiments also were done to evaluate how much sway occupants could comfortably tolerate. However, many subjects experienced dizziness and other ill effects. One of the chief engineers, Leslie Robertson, worked with Canadian engineer Alan G. Davenport to develop viscoelastic dampers to absorb some of the sway. These viscoelastic dampers, used throughout the structures at the joints between floor trusses and perimeter columns along with some other structural modifications, reduced the building sway to an acceptable level. Construction. In March 1965, the Port Authority began acquiring property at the World Trade Center site. Demolition work began on March 21, 1966. To clear 13 square blocks of low-rise buildings in Radio Row for construction of the World Trade Center. Groundbreaking for the construction of the World Trade Center took place on August 5, 1966. The site of the World Trade Center was located on landfill with the bedrock located 65 feet below. To construct the World Trade Center, it was necessary to build a bathtub with a slurry wall around the West Street side of the site, to keep water from the Hudson River out. The slurry method selected by Port Authority's chief engineer, John M. Kyle, Jr., involved digging a trench, and as excavation proceeded, filling the space with a slurry mixture composed of bentonite and water, which plugged holes and kept groundwater out. When the trench was dug out, a steel cage was inserted and concrete was poured in, forcing the slurry out. It took 14 months for the slurry wall to be completed. It was necessary before excavation of material from the interior of the site could begin. The 1,200,000 cubic yards of material excavated were used to expand the Manhattan shoreline across West Street to form Battery Park City. In January 1967, the Port Authority awarded $74 million in contracts to various steel suppliers, and Carl Koch was hired to erect the steel. Tishman Realty and Construction was hired in February 1967 to oversee construction of the project. Construction work began on the North Tower in August 1968. Construction on the South Tower was underway by January 1969. The original Hudson tubes, carrying PATH trains into Hudson Terminal, remained in service as elevated tunnels during the construction process until 1971, when a new PATH station opened. The topping out ceremony of 1 WTC took place on December 23, 1970, while 2 WTC's ceremony occurred later on July 19, 1971. The first tenants moved into the North Tower on December 15, 1970. The South Tower accepted tenants in January 1972. When the World Trade Center Twin Towers were completed, the total cost to the Port Authority had reached $900 million. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was on April 4, 1973. In addition to the Twin Towers, the plan for the World Trade Center complex included 4 other low-rise buildings, which were built in the early 1970s. The 47-story 7 World Trade Center building was added in the 1980s, to the north of the main complex. Altogether, the main World Trade Center complex occupied a 16-acre superblock. Criticism: plans to build the World Trade Center were controversial. The site for the World Trade Center was the location of Radio Row, home to hundreds of commercial and industrial tenants, property owners, small businesses, and approximately 100 residents, many of whom fiercely resisted forced relocation. A group of small businesses affected filed an injunction challenging the Port Authority's power of eminent domain. The case made its way through the court system to the United States Supreme Court. The court refused to accept the case. Private real estate developers and members of the Real Estate Board of New York, led by Empire State Building owner Lawrence A. Wien, expressed concerns about this much subsidized office space going on the open market, competing with the private sector when there was already a glut of vacancies. The World Trade Center itself was not rented out completely until after 1979, and then only due to the fact that the complex's subsidy by the Port Authority made rents charged for its office space relatively cheaper than that of comparable office space in other buildings. Others questioned whether the Port Authority should have taken on a project described by some as of mistaken social priority. The World Trade Center design brought criticism of its aesthetics from the American Institute of Architects and other groups. Lewis Mumford, author of The City in History and other works on urban planning, criticized the project and described it and other new skyscrapers as just glass and metal filing cabinets. The Twin Towers were described as looking similar to the boxes that the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building came in. The Twin Towers' narrow office windows, only 18 inches wide and framed by pillars that restricted views on each side to narrow slots, were disliked by many. Activist and sociologist Jane Jacobs also criticized plans for the WTC's construction, arguing that the waterfront should be kept open for New Yorkers to enjoy. The Trade Center's superblock, replacing a more traditional, dense neighborhood, was regarded by some critics as an inhospitable environment that disrupted the complicated traffic network typical of Manhattan. For example, in his book The Pentagon of Power, Lewis Mumford denounced the center as an example of the purposeless giantism and technological exhibitionism that are now eviscerating the living tissue of every great city. For many years, the immense Austin J. Tobin Plaza was often beset by brisk winds at ground level owing to the Venturi effect between the two towers. In fact, some gusts were so high that pedestrian travel had to be aided by ropes. In 1999, the outdoor plaza reopened after undergoing $12 million renovations, which involved replacing marble pavers with gray and pink granite stones, adding new benches, planters, new restaurants, food kiosks and outdoor dining areas.